Welcome everybody to this month's update for the COVID analysis that I do. And I will go through the outline. Much of this is the standard material summary, look at the world and the regions and what's changed over the last month. Results of all the global models for countries, cases, and deaths. A little bit of a special topic on underreporting in India. There's been some reports and studies that have come out for both cases and deaths that, based on a question Wayne actually asked last month, I dug into and I thought was interesting. Then results of the US models, an update on global and national case fatality risk distributions, and the standard view of California counties and the sum of the counties model, local updates around Santa Barbara County and in our adjoining counties, and then some updates on variants and vaccines, and that's it. So a couple new things and then a lot of the standard kinds of updates. So in summary, as a planet, we're experiencing fewer new cases each day than we were last month. It was just peaking last month between 650 and 700,000 cases a day, and it's down to about 450,000 cases a day now, which is still, lots of cases, but lower than it was at the end of August. So not surprisingly, most of the resurgences that we're looking at, or that I showed last time, are declining, but not all of them, but most of them. Some regions and countries that were under control for a long part of the pandemic are still seeing large numbers of new cases. Actually, not so much large growth in new cases, but large numbers of new cases. New variants continue to emerge, but so far there's nothing to indicate that anything that we know of right now is going to displace Delta. And I'll show you some data on that. And Delta is dominant pretty much everywhere. And the places where it's not dominant, it seems to be growing. So I have some graphs on that. Vaccinations continue to grow globally. And even though we're not seeing it in the US, globally we're seeing new doses administered continue to go up. It's up to 26 million doses a day, which is really remarkable to me. A lot of the Western countries are pretty well vaccinated, and so daily vaccinations are declining. And some of the more highly vaccinated countries still see high per capita cases. And I'll update some of those things that I showed last month in terms of who's seeing the most new cases per capita and the most new deaths, and how does that relate to their degree of vaccination. As a reminder, I added a fifth outbreak to the model terms, as many of the outbreaks required it to be properly described by the model. As we've seen in the US, we've had really 5 distinct surges of outbreak across the country, and to really model that, I needed a fifth outbreak model. And several jurisdictions have tired of reporting COVID daily, and so they're reporting it weekly. And as a result, my averaging method needed to be adjusted. So I've moved from a 7-day centered to a 7-day lagging average to estimate the daily cases or deaths. And as has happened throughout really the pandemic, all the way back when China in last February dumped in 80,000, or not 80,000, 15,000 clinically diagnosed cases and disrupted their data. That continues to happen as people either redefine or rediscover it. It even just happened in Santa Barbara County this week. I'll talk about that. So it is a caveat that overlays all this, especially when we look at the India reporting information. The data are the best these jurisdictions can do at the time, hopefully. But it's still causes disruptions and makes some of the modeling difficult. So all the data that I have for cases and deaths is extracted from the Johns Hopkins database. As always, these are data from Friday, the 1st of October, for all of the countries and U.S. counties. This is the overall march of the outbreaks across time. I've left this at 10 subdivisions of time, so they're now 66 days apart. As the outbreak drags on, these get farther apart unless I want to add more rows, which I'm concerned may make this less legible. But at any rate, these last charcoal colored row are the data from October 1st. And these are the 50 largest outbreaks as of October 1st. Not a lot of difference. The only new outbreak in the top 50 is Vietnam. And that displaced Saudi Arabia, which dropped out of the top 50. And Vietnam is certainly one of those countries that cruised along with an exemplary management of COVID. I'm not sure I understand exactly what they were doing differently than everybody else, but for over a year, they really managed it very well. And they've recently had a very big outbreak and joined the top 50 largest outbreaks in the world. They're coming down now, as you'll see. In terms of what's been happening with the outbreaks, there's been some growth in some subsets of the large outbreaks, but with the overall daily new cases declining, not as much as last month. No new outbreaks over 100 in the last 2 months. In this range between 500,000 and 2 million, these kind of medium-large outbreaks, there's been about a 15% increase in all those categories in that range in the last 30 days. But in the categories above that, from 5 million on up, there's been no change in the last 30 days. So we don't have any outbreaks between 10 million and 20 million still. So you have these big three, the US, India, and Brazil, that are all over 20 million cases. Then you have Europe and Western Asia outbreaks like Turkey and Iran and UK and Russia that are in the 2 to 5 million, or the 5 to 10 million range. So, and then the rest as the categories go down. The minimum size in the top 50 outbreaks is now about 600,000. So it was about 500,000 last month. So that continues to creep up. How things have changed regionally is not really a whole lot. There's been a little bit of shifting as the cases have come down, as I mentioned, from about 700,000 to about 450,000 a day. There's been a little bit of shifting in the regions. You can see Eastern Europe is growing a little bit. North America is pretty steady. Western, Southern, and Northern Europe have gone down a little bit. East Asia is subsiding a little bit. South Asia is slowly subsiding a little bit. And Southeast Asia is also subsiding a little bit. But really, when I break it down by the percentages, they move around by a few percent, but there hasn't been a dramatic change. And while it looked like Africa may have more significant share, as both the northern and sub-Saharan African regions go down, that continues to go down. It's down from 5% last month to 3% this month. So the concerns that a lot of folks had about a real wildfire breaking out in Africa haven't really happened, which is good. So moving on to the country models, these are database from October 1st. These are the R-squareds. They're all pretty good. This outlier here is Kazakhstan, which is the same outlier it was last month because they've had, particularly in the case of fatalities, they have had a lot of data issues repeatedly with fatalities. So it's a very noisy data set. So if we look at the cumulative cases, you can see this is clearly concave downward, which means it's, the derivative is declining. So the new cases are declining. The US up here, India and Brazil, all these are flattening out. We've got a couple concave upward outbreaks like Russia. The UK is a little bit that way. But for the most part, these are pretty flattened or concave downward. And you can see that in the daily cases models, the spaghetti graph here. This little uptick in the last 4 days, I'm not sure if that's just a data anomaly at the end of the week or if there is really something going on. Don't see it too much in the country models, as you'll see when I go through those. In the cases of fatalities, we also see that bending over a little bit concave downward, indicating it's likely peaking. And these big three, the US, India, and Brazil, and then the rest of them, nobody really flaring up, most countries peaking of the very large outbreaks in fatalities as well as cases. And this is the way that the cumulative models look. Similar kind of a little cowlick on the end here with fatalities going up, but certainly the model isn't responding to that. And you see there's none of the 10 biggest outbreaks that are represented here have an upturn in the modeling of their daily new fatalities. So the 5 largest outbreaks are similar to last month, except the UK replaced France. It's almost like there's one spot reserved for Western Europe, and sometimes it's Spain, and sometimes it's France, and sometimes it's the UK. So this month it's the UK instead of France. And the UK is struggling to come down. They had one of the early peaks in the recent resurgence in Europe, and they haven't really brought it down like the other countries that you'll see on the next slide in Europe. They've really been stuck over 25,000 cases a day since this July. As a result, they passed France. Brazil and India are both down. It's good. This is, as low as Brazil has been since last October. So it's really been a year since Brazil has had this low level of daily new cases. The US is clearly down from its peak. Russia, which looked like it was declining still last month, is now turned up again, and the model is fitting a resurgence in cases for Russia. And of the 5, that's the only one that looks like it may exceed its previous peak. At least the model is predicting it will. Sometime in mid-November, it'll peak at a new record. So this is the rest of Western Europe other than the UK that was on the previous slide: France, Spain, Italy, and Germany. And they're all at various points coming down from their most recent peaks. Germany just for a few weeks. Spain and France, for quite a while, and significantly lower. So a lot of the whatever you want to call it, late summer, early fall surges that we saw across Western Europe and North America all look like they've peaked and are heading down. Latin America, I think this is the best overall Latin America's looked in probably a year. So you remember it's usually, Argentina and Colombia are down, but Mexico and Peru are going up. But all the major outbreaks in Latin America are down and looking like they're under much better control, even Brazil. And some of them are really quite low. Colombia, Argentina, Chile, and Peru are all really at 10% or so of their peaks. So that's good news. In Central and Western Asia, you've got pretty much everybody except Turkey down significantly from their most recent peak. Turkey is struggling to come down, still up in the 20, 25,000 cases a day range. The model fits it to be peaking right now, but last month it fit it that way too also. So we'll have to see. But Turkey seems to be struggling to get down in terms of new cases from their most recent peak. Still not quite as high as they were in the spring, but not coming down yet. But the other outbreaks in this region, the big outbreaks around Iraq and Kazakhstan, are all down significantly. In Eastern Europe, you've got a little bit more mixed bag of behavior. So Ukraine is appearing to be seeing significant growth in daily new cases. The model expects them to hit a new peak, kind of like Russia. Other places in Eastern Europe are maintaining for quite a while very low levels of new cases, Czechia and Poland and Hungary. And then Serbia, which looked out of control last month with increases in daily new cases, looks like it's just peaking now. So we'll see. It's probably too early to say for sure, but it certainly over the last couple of weeks hasn't seen new case growth. South Asia, all the outbreaks are declining. Bangladesh, Pakistan, and Nepal are all pretty low compared to their most recent peaks. And as you recall, India, even though India has really a pretty high number of daily new cases, 25, 30,000 new cases a day, compared to where they were, they're much lower. And, they have a huge population. So on a per capita basis, it's not that many, but that's a big number of cases. But I think their healthcare capacity can handle the level where they are right now. So South Asia, as you saw in the regional graph, overall slowly coming down, and its share of the global cases declined a little bit over the last month. In North Africa and the Middle East, a couple of these looked at new peaks last month, and all of these 6 large outbreaks have declined significantly or stabilized at low levels, like Jordan, UAE, Morocco, Lebanon, Tunisia, and Israel, which had a very recent, very big surge, very sharply declining now, really steep up and a sharp peak and a sharp decline. So I'm not sure anybody has an explanation for why some peaks last for a long time, like in the UK or like Russia's did before it started turning up again, versus countries that have extremely sharp peaks, like the previous peak in the UK or the one in Japan or this one in Israel. Southeast Asia, which was quite a big hotspot over the last 2 months, the previous month and the month before that, all of those outbreaks look to be coming down now. Philippines is down from 22 or 23,000, about 15,000, and Malaysia. Both of those it wasn't clear that they were peaking last month. Vietnam, as I mentioned, is a new entrant to the top 50, so I haven't been showing it in previous months, but it also looks like it's coming down. But this behavior, like in Thailand and Vietnam, where the total cases are just so low for so long and then shoot up, and in just a few months, Vietnam has 1 million cases. It's a very interesting behavior that's different than most other places. But even in Southeast Asia, which is sort of the most recent, previously lightly touched region to get very big outbreaks, those are all look to be declining now. And these are the 4 that I put down as last month's hotspots. So these were all looked at new peaks or still out of control. And they're really all pretty much coming down. Canada, the model is fitting it as a peak right now. It may or may not really be, but that's the way the model's fitting it. The others are all declining. And again, Japan has one of these very, very steep outbreaks. Is it the Olympics or is it something else? I don't know. But it's unusually steep, similar to what we saw in Vietnam and some of the other ones. And Cuba, which was also a more recent entry to the 50 biggest outbreaks after going, at pretty low levels of new cases, is now down quite a bit, by more than a third from where their peak was. So this was one of the topics I wanted to introduce as a new one that is triggered by a question I got last month about underreporting in India. And there's been some stuff published, both for cases and deaths, that make a very strong case that there's been, a very huge amount of underreporting in India. And for cases, it's been based predominantly on the seroprevalence of antibodies to the virus. So they've taken surveys multiple times of the population to estimate what fraction of the population has been exposed to COVID based on the presence of antibodies in the blood samples they take. And they've done it from May of 2020, and then the most recent one was in July of 2021. The academic paper describing the findings from the July survey hasn't come to the preprint yet, but there are news articles of what the Department of Public Health in India, or the Ministry of Public Health, said about it. But as you can see, in May 2020, for example, the seroprevalence was about 0.7%. So about 7 out of 1,000 of the samples they took indicated that person had been exposed to COVID in a significant enough way that they developed antibodies to it. In the official cases that they had was only 1 in 10,000. So 0.01% of the population had been identified as a case and reported as a case by India. So that ratio was about 51. So there were about 51 times more people that had COVID, whether it was asymptomatic or mildly symptomatic, but about 51 times more people had been exposed to COVID than actually were reported as cases. And as it progressed through these subsequent seroprevalence studies, the seroprevalence continued to go up. It went to 7% and then 24%. And in the one this July, it was actually 67%, which indicated that about 2/3 of the entire population had been exposed to COVID. And India has 1.3 something billion people, so that's a lot of people. But the official cases were only about 2% of the population, which is also a lot of people, but not as many as 67. So the ratio of cases that they actually test and confirm and report to cases that they likely had has been declining. It's declined from 51 to about 30, but that ratio is still very high. And as a result, it suggests there's been a lot more COVID in India than the official statistics report. And it's pretty compelling, and the ability to repeat these results with ratios of the same order of magnitude, growing in the same way as cases are growing, makes to me pretty indisputable that there's been a huge underreporting of cases in India. We've done seroprevalence studies in the US too, and they haven't seen ratios anything like this. I think a lot of the people think maybe the ratio in the US might be 4, but I don't know that we know that for sure. There was also a review of deaths, and they unfortunately, they didn't have a really all-encompassing graph, but they looked at, to put in here to illustrate it, but they looked at three different things: deaths in healthcare settings. They surveyed people for deaths at home, household deaths, and then regionally reported deaths, and compared that to the deaths in 2018 and 2019. And all three of them came to the same conclusion, that there was about a 30% excess death level in the course of the pandemic compared to historical death levels. And that's about 3 million cases of fatalities. And the author's conclusion is that they put confidence intervals on it that are about from 3.1 to 3.5 million COVID deaths in India, actually, and that they capture many that die in hospitals and they capture few that die at home. And the current official death toll, when you look it up, is about 450,000. So it's about, that ratio is about 6.5 in terms of fatalities. So the references are on there, but they're very interesting studies, and I think illustrate some of the struggles, especially in such a populous country with such a diverse population, from rural to really densely populated urban areas, to really accurately gather data and track what's going on with the pandemic, which it appears they struggle with. So on to the U.S. states. So same thing, models developed for all the states in D.C. The sum of the states models predicts about 50 million cases for the U.S. Last month it was 45 million. The country model predicts about 45 million. So we're right there on the edge if we don't have any more new outbreaks of being at or just under 50 million cases, which is significant because if we get to 50 million cases, I'll have to add another row to my outbreaks graph. But at any rate, that's what the model's predicting, and about 1 million deaths for the sum of the states models. So, which is probably, I think is probably a little high. There's some states where it's modeling a big tail up in deaths, and that would result in a 2.4% case fatality risk versus 1.6 now. So the prediction is a little bit higher than last month. Deaths are about the same. It certainly looks like resurgences are peaking in most of the states. And as I mentioned, the individual country model predicts about 45 million and about 800,000 fatalities. Again, this month, about 1.2%, or about 4 million more people were confirmed as a case of COVID. That's almost exactly the same as last month. But it was about triple the rate in July. And about 3%, again, of the population received the vaccine over the same period. And that's about half the rate of 4 months ago. And I'll have some graphs on that. So this is the cumulative case graph, and you can see both the country and all the large outbreak states are concave downward and leveling out. And that's what we see in the new daily cases models, and the sum of the models. We're down, a third from our most recent peak that happened in first half of September, and never reached the levels that we saw in January, but it still was over 150,000, and we're still over 100,000 cases a day. So it's still a lot of cases. If you compare the first two peaks, never reached the level that we're at now, coming down. And none of these large outbreaks you can see are being fit as starting a new resurgence. In terms of deaths, lagging, as we usually see, it's heading up pretty much linearly. It's hard to see the concave downward on the total, but you can see it in a lot of the states, including some of the ones, Florida and Texas, for example, that that had very notable surges in deaths recently. And you can see that, and this you can see is the little uptick that's being fit, mostly driven by Ohio, which the model is fitting as not having peaked in fatalities yet. This is a little bit of a busy graph. I've been adding, this has been one that's been in there for a few months that I've been adding to it, so I'll walk through it. You know, in a lot of the resurgences, you could pick a handful of states and say, well, this is 30% of the population and they are generating half the new cases. That isn't really so much true anymore. It was a little bit true last month, but this month is certainly not. So the 7 states that contributed the most cases to the new cases over the last 2 weeks only accounted for about 40% of the new cases, and they're over 40% of the population. So they're the big states, but they're not seeing disproportionately higher case counts than would be expected based on their population for the most part. So Texas, California, and Florida are all, you know, within 25% of what you'd expect based on the population. Ohio and North Carolina are above that. That's why they're red and bolded. But not, they're just at above 25%, both of them. Ohio a little bit more. So that's not as interesting a table anymore, but it's you know, mandatory elements. It's been in there so many months. So the more interesting table, I think, is who has had the most new cases per 10,000 population in the last 2 weeks. So between September 17th and October 1st. And the most have been in Alaska. They've had 207 cases per 10,000 and that new cases. And that's much higher than any of the states had in this table last month. Then West Virginia, Wyoming, Montana, and Kentucky. So a little bit geographically dispersed, more than last month. If you remember last month, it was pretty much all in the Southeast, plus Alaska was still in there, in the top 10, but not in the top 5. Or no, they were in the top 5. I take that back. And the fewest new cases per 10,000, Connecticut, California, Maryland, New Jersey, and Illinois. Again, not all concentrated in an area like they were pretty much in the Northeast last month. So it's a lot more as the resurgences are subsiding very broadly in the U.S. These are getting more geographically dispersed, these top few. And when you look at the top and bottom 10, so these are the 5 that are in the table plus the next 5. You can see that in the northern central part of the U.S., there's a little bit of a cluster. And in the Ohio Valley, there's a little bit of a cluster. But really, it's hard to draw a conclusion that it's really a regional, very regionally specific when you look at all the scatter across the country. California has had the second lowest of all the states in the last 2 weeks in terms of per capita new cases. So that's good for California. And these are the graphs of the state outbreaks. You can see Texas is down about half from their most recent peak. California, we never really got very close to our previous January peak, and we're now down about 2/3 of the way down there. Florida is very far down from their peak. These others, Ohio and New York, North Carolina, are just peaking. North Carolina peaked a little bit earlier. And Pennsylvania looks like it's just peaking, but really just leveling out right now. So, but of these 7 most new cases in the last 2 weeks states, none of them are going up and seeing increases in daily new cases. And when we look at the map that I usually show, most states are declining. So totally only 14 states and the District of Columbia had more cases in the last 7 days than the 7 before that, versus 43 last month, and which is a big difference, right? So that's less than a third of what we had last month. And there were only 2 states that hit a new high in daily cases. So this is an all-time pandemic record high. And that was Alaska and Vermont, which are same number. We had 2 states last month. They were different states though, but this month it was Alaska and Vermont. And I asked myself, really? Vermont? I mean, Vermont's been like at the highest vaccination rates and low case rates, and they're always at the bottom of all my sorted lists of things about COVID, and they hit a new peak. So, but these 2 peaks are really quite different. Alaska is having, as you saw in the previous table 2 slides ago, 207 new cases per 10,000 over the last 14 days. Vermont has had 43 new cases per 10,000 over the last 14 days. So yes, they both hit all-time highs. The difference is Alaska's per capita case rate is the highest, so they're having a very significant and difficult to handle outbreak in Alaska right now. Vermont, even though it's at its all-time record high, is still in the bottom third. They didn't really make the 10 best green-colored states list, but they still are in the lower third in terms of new cases per capita. So yeah, it's a new peak. It's definitely an outbreak, but it hasn't risen to the level of transmission that's causing a problem in Vermont. But and it's actually where Judy and I spent last weekend. So maybe it was the wedding that caused this peak. I don't know. So one last thing before we move on to California, I wanted to update case fatality risk distribution. So I haven't shown much about individual jurisdictions' case fatality risk in a while. So I should probably explain the graph a little bit. This is a probability plot, kind of similar to the plots I showed the R-squareds that includes a confidence interval for a log normal distribution, a best fit log normal distribution, which describes these pretty well, the distribution. And each dot on here is a country. And on the x-axis is that country's case fatality risk. And then this percentile is scaled based on the way that the log normal distribution looks. And these outliers I labeled. So you can see all the countries, there's a big range from the UAE at about 0.3% case fatality risk. So 3 people out of 1,000 that get COVID end up becoming a fatality. And Israel, which I think is about 0.6, all the way up to Mexico and Peru, which are 8 and 9% roughly. So that's a pretty big range, and that's how it looks globally. The overall global case fatality risk is about 2%, so here in the middle, but this is the distribution among the countries. So this is a pretty big distribution. It's about a 30-fold range. Earlier in the pandemic, for our longtime listeners, remember it was more than 2 orders of magnitude range. It was over 100x difference. So it is narrowing, both in the U.S. and globally, that the dispersion of the case fatality risk across countries is narrowing. But it's still really pretty broad. 30x is a pretty big difference. And it's interesting how these 2 are regionally proximate. And these 2 are regionally proximate. I don't know exactly why it's that way, but there certainly are a lot of things that can skew this number, beyond the virus, and some include the virus. But testing availability, like we saw in the U.S., when you can't test very many people, when they die, but you don't know when they have a case. So you end up underestimating the denominator because you don't catch many of the cases, and so the case fatality risk looks high. Healthcare quality obviously varies a lot among countries. Variant history, some of the variants have been tested or are believed to likely to be cause more severe illness and have an inherently higher case fatality risk, and the timing of cases. So it's certainly in many of the outbreaks where there have been multiple outbreaks, the earlier ones had higher case fatality risk. And whether it was because we learned more about how to treat it or we got better at testing more people. But there's a lot of factors that can cause this.
Dave, question.
Yeah.
Before you were talking about India underreporting, where on this does India fall with their official reports, and how much would it move if those underreported deaths were included that were suspected? Do you know?
Well, yeah, so India, I think, is, in the neighborhood of between 20 and 30 million cases officially reported. And if their ratio is really 30, that would be 600 million or so. And if they have 3 million deaths, that would be 1 out of 200. That'd be still a very low case fatality risk. But I think in many countries, it's that ratio of cases to cases. So if we say that was for like the US, it would be about 2%, which is kind of the global average. So I don't know that the underreporting necessarily understates the case fatality risk, but it just understates the absolute number of deaths. We've seen that. We see that in Russia certainly has under-assigned deaths to COVID, like India also. Making me do math in my head in public. That's not good. Let's see. And then in the US, we have a much narrower distribution of case fatality risk among states. The lowest are Alaska and Utah, and they're both well under 1%, about 0.5 and 0.6%. So not as low as UAE, but similar to Israel. And New Jersey is the highest at about 2.4%, so much lower than Peru and Mexico, and actually not that different than the global case fatality risk. As you may remember, early in the pandemic, New Jersey and New York were pushing 10% case fatality risk. So it certainly converged over the course of the pandemic to not just a narrower distribution, but a lower maximum. And these data, just for full disclosure, this p-value of 0.047 says that I have to reject the hypothesis that a log normal distribution describes these data well, but it's so close that I put it in here just to find which ones lied out beyond the 95% confidence interval. In the US, our overall case fatality risk is about 1.6%. So, and you can see that kind of goes right through the middle of this distribution. So most of the states and most of the countries, are distributed in kind of a not too surprising way along a distribution. I think the thing that surprises me is the breadth of both these distributions, really, particularly the global one. But even in the US, that we'd have a 5x ratio of the case fatality risk among the 50 states intuitively surprised me. And these ranges, I think, as I mentioned, have narrowed significantly over the course of the pandemic, both when you look across states and when you look across nations. Moving on to California, county models. So Santa Clara gets a call out for being bad data managers. They added about 100 deaths all at once and then pulled them out less than a week later and made my R squared depressed. But other than that, the models describe these outbreaks pretty well.
As a resident of Santa Clara, I apologize.
Thank you.
I apologize. We didn't mean that.
So for California, I look at the 30 largest county outbreaks.
Oh, I need to find my vape real quick.
And some of those predict about 5 million cases for California and about 100,000 deaths, which is about a 1.4% case fatality risk, which is similar to where it is now. The case prediction is about the same as last month, and the death prediction has gone up a little bit from 80K to 100K. And the cases began rising early in July, and then deaths about a month later, so a little bit longer lag than previous outbreaks in early August. Cases, as you can see, this is LA County, which, since it makes up about a quarter of our population, is kind of dominates a lot of the trends statewide. You can see it's down significantly from its peak. It looks like deaths are kind of peaking. The model fits it as the deaths still rising, not quite peaking yet. But by eye, it looks like it's just peaking now in deaths. Some of the counties' models, cumulative, you can see it's really getting pretty level, pretty much across the board. And you can see that in the way that the daily case models are all heading down from their most recent peak. Fatalities, not quite leveling out yet, but definitely look like they're turning over. San Diego is fitting as having an increase in deaths still to come, have not peaked yet. And this is the way that shows on the some of the counties in daily fatalities. This yellow line is San Diego, causing the total to not quite peak yet. For Santa Barbara County, we haven't really started declining much from the peak we had. We've been hanging around between 90 and 120 cases a day for a month and a half. So it isn't really declining. It rose a bit over the last week. There was a set or a caveat with the data from 9/28 that there were some backlog test results that somehow hadn't been reported in previous periods that got dumped in on September 28th because they heard I was giving a talk today. And that may be the source of this turning up, or it may not. It's too early to tell. In terms of testing positivity, and we peaked in mid-August at about 9% positive, which is pretty high. These are the old yellow, orange, red, purple tiers that we used to have. So that was certainly in the purple in terms of the positivity. We're down into the orange now. We're about 4%, which is where it was in early July, but still about 6 times what it was in the beginning of June. So it certainly looks like we're heading down, but we haven't quite seen it yet in the daily new cases. Hospitalizations have fallen. If you look at the blue line here, from around 80 to around 50 over the last month. So that's good. They never really approached where they were in January, just like cases and fatalities didn't. Deaths have been pretty flat over the last month, about 0.8 per day. We're one every 1.2 days, however you want to say it. And the case fatality rate here is about 1.2%, excluding the PRISM, which is the same as last month. That hasn't changed in quite a while. So we're kind of stable is the way I describe it right now. We're definitely not going down rapidly in cases or fatalities. We're hovering in the 50-60 range in hospitalizations for the last 2 weeks. And not seeing things move a lot one way or another. In the neighboring counties, they all look pretty similar. The other counties are down, more clearly from their peak. If you look at the overall cumulative population confirmed case rates, the biggest is Kern at about 15%, and then Ventura is at about 12%, and San Luis Obispo and Santa Barbara County at about 10%. And those all went up 2 or 3% or 1 to 2% over the last month. So they're still going up a little bit, but down from where they were in August. Okay, on to variance updates. Okay, so an update to global variance. This graph doesn't look a lot different than it did last month. So mutation rate is pretty much the same, about 2 substitutions per month on average. And all these sort of turquoise looking dots are all Delta variant, different versions of the Delta variant that have been sequenced. That hasn't really changed much since August, other than the mean number of substitutions went up by a couple. If you look at the proportion of variants, you can see it also hasn't changed a whole lot from last month, except that Delta is now even more. So globally, 95% of the cases sequenced as of 9/20 are Delta. So it's clearly the dominant, almost exclusive form of the virus that everybody is seeing. There are a couple. I mean, it's not 95% in every country, and I'll show some graphs about that. But globally, it is what COVID. When we say COVID now, we mean the Delta variant. And there have been new variants observed, as you can see in the graph above, but nothing seems to be challenging Delta right now. It's in charge. This is an update based on the CDC assessments. And so there have been a couple things that changed here. There's been a little bit more data on Delta in terms of its transmissibility, which now is being cited as over 2 times as transmissible as the previous versions of the variants. So that's been changed, at least in this table, from likely to be more transmissible to more than 100% more transmissible. And the other thing that has happened is just last week, or the week before, on the 21st of September, CDC reclassified all the variants of concern to variants being monitored because their prevalence in the US was just so low, because Delta's prevalence was so high. So the only official variant of concern per the CDC right now for the US is Delta. And the others are just variants being monitored just because they're really pretty rare now. So Alpha, P1 or Gamma, all those are now just variants being monitored. Still no variants of high consequence. The Mu variant that I talked about last month it hadn't been named Mu yet. It was 21H, which is the next strain name. And the WHO named it early in September as Mu. It's a variant being monitored in the US, not a variant of concern. And Lambda, which is the one I introduced a couple months ago, which had been prevalent in Peru, still isn't yet classified by the CDC. Hasn't been seen too much. You can see Mu in the CDC variant populations, but very, very little Lambda. So here's what it looks like in a few countries, and these are the same countries I showed last month because they're the ones that can show what's going on with Lambda and Mu, as well as Gamma. So here's the US and the UK, which was the place where Alpha, the first sort of big variant that spread quite a bit, came. And you can see it's now been 100% Delta for 2 months in the UK. This is the US, and you can see we had quite a big surge of Alpha, a little bit of Gamma, and then pretty much since August, it's been almost all Delta in the US. Brazil, where P1 was for months was the dominant form of the virus, is now, 85% Delta. So Delta has successfully displaced P1 to a large extent in Brazil. Peru, which is where Lambda arose and was dominant for quite a while. So you can see this green creeping in here. This is Delta again. And it looks, and always the last line to the right on these graphs is made up of a relatively small number of samples. So the numbers aren't very precise, but it appears to be displacing both Lambda and Gamma in Peru now. And if you look at Colombia, where 21H or Mu was dominant, you can see Delta now has more sequences than Mu in the most recent 2 weeks. So it looks like Delta is beginning to displace Lambda and Mu even in the outbreaks where those variants were first detected. Here's how it looks in the US. Delta has represented 98% or more of the sequence cases since August, so more than a month. And you can see the last week here is, it's just all Delta. Mu and Lambda certainly have yet to get a foothold. You can see in some of these thin slices up here, some of this is Mu, but we'll see how it evolves. But the Mu and Lambda certainly have been detected in the US, but have yet to get a foothold or really show evidence they're going to displace Delta. And this is the way it looks in some states. Really, this is the way it looks in pretty much all the states. I could pick any states and they'd all be pretty much all Delta. So the green here, but these are the biggest ones. In California, we're in the last reporting 98% Delta. And in Santa Barbara, not a different story. Most of the variants being monitored have been detected in Santa Barbara, at least relatively recently, including Mu and Gamma. But Delta has become dominant. It was about 93% in July, about 95% in August. It's 100% in September, but there's, as you can see, less than 20 sequences yet that comprise our assessment of September. And it's what we see in Santa Barbara, just like everywhere else. And in terms of the number of samples that we're sequencing here, it's 200 in July. And last month, just to give you an idea of how much this lags because of the, it's a relatively complex lab operation to do the sequencing and has some cycle time to it. Last month, at the end of August, the total for July was 130. So the total for July went up by 50% for results that came in September. So there's more than a 4-week lag to really getting the complete breakdown of all the sequences that are submitted for variant monitoring. So that's just something to apply to these numbers for August and September. So if the same ratio held, I have no reason to necessarily think it would, but if it did, we'd end up with about 100 sequences in August, and we would still have a third of them yet to get. But they're mostly going to be Delta anyway. So, and same with September we're going to have a lot more sequences come in. But as of right now, it's pretty much all Delta. Vaccines. So this is a set of some of the bigger countries, or an interesting set. This used to say most populous countries. Now I just say assorted countries because it's really not chosen strictly by population. But you can see there's a very big range from the UAE up there near the top, all the way down to mostly African countries that are very low, 10% or less, Egypt and Kenya and Ethiopia and Tanzania, and then everybody else spread out in between. So there still is a really very large disparity among countries in terms of the degree of vaccinations, even some of which have very large outbreaks, like the Philippines and Pakistan and Russia, for example, that are well below 40%. The other interesting statistic that was cited at the Our World in Data site where I extract these data is only 2.3% of people in low-income countries, and I don't know exactly how they define that, but have received a dose. So it's still the distribution of vaccines, even though we're doing 26 million doses a day, is pretty unbalanced based on population or need. So the U.S. started well. You can see if you look back in April, we were, near the front of the pack. We've been passed by a lot of countries now. We're leveling out. I'll show a little more data on that in a minute. Globally, about 45% have received the dose, so that's up 12% from July, which is a pretty big lot of, that's 700, that it's almost a billion people. It's really pretty remarkable. So totally about 3.5 billion people have received the dose of the vaccine, and I left this in the same thing I said last month, is just to appreciate what an unprecedented accomplishment that is to develop, distribute, and administer 3.5 billion doses of vaccine in, I don't know, from the time we started, 16, 17 months. It's just amazing. It's now more doses of vaccine than all the iPhones ever made, just to put it in perspective. Yeah. So looking at this based on, this is similar to what I showed last month. So these are just the countries that have daily new cases more than 400 per million per day. So these are the countries with the most significant rates of community transmission of COVID in the world. And you can see they range all across the board in terms of degree to which their populations are vaccinated. So very wide range. United Kingdom has a pretty big vaccination rate. Cuba, which really has very aggressively administered vaccines as their bad outbreak started 6 or 8 weeks ago, but still having quite a large number of new cases per day. So the range among these countries is about 400 to 1,000 new cases per million per day. The global new cases per million per day is 60. So these range from 6 to 15 times the global average in terms of community transmission. So there isn't much correspondence that we can see just from this grouping kind of analysis that where the degree of vaccination corresponds to very low levels of new cases per day per capita.
Hey, Dave, if you were to overlay the types of vaccines, would that take care of some of the noise that you're seeing? I mean, like the Sinovac versus, some of these different vaccines that we don't see here.
Yeah, I mean, some places it would. I would suspect Mongolia is probably mostly the Sinovac vaccine, but it's not in the United Kingdom. It's not in Israel. So I don't think that would illuminate too much, because certainly maybe Cuba's Sputnik. I don't know. I haven't looked at what, I don't know what kind of vaccine is happening in Cuba, but I know that in the United Kingdom, it's Oxford and AstraZeneca and Pfizer, similar to what we have here, except we don't have AstraZeneca here so much. But and in Israel, it's Pfizer and Moderna. So I don't think it explains it very well. The situation is a little bit different when we look at fatalities, similar to what it is last month. So there's still a wide range of vaccinations. The for the countries with the highest rates of fatalities. So these have more than 7 deaths per million per day. But all but one of these countries was less than 45% vaccinated 30 days ago. Lithuania, I have no idea what's going on there. Maybe that is a type of vaccine effect or something. But Lithuania, even 30 days ago, was more than 50% vaccinated. But all the rest of these were less than 45% vaccinated 30 days ago. And interestingly, all the countries that became more than 40% vaccinated a month ago that were on this list last month are off it now. So Fiji, Malaysia, Sri Lanka, and Cuba were all on this list in terms of having the highest per capita fatalities. And they've all crossed into that greater than 50% vaccinated and have fallen off this list. So there does appear to be, through this, again, sort of grouping and partitioning analysis, some correspondence between high levels of vaccination and low levels of per capita fatalities, which isn't surprising based on all the data we have on hospitalizations and severe illness being really dramatically reduced in the vaccinated populations. And the range here, these range from 7 to about 60 new deaths per million per day. Global, we average about 1. So this is an even bigger ratio compared to the global average. So looking at what's going on with the US in terms of vaccination, this upper graph is very, hard to get a lot of data out of. All the names of all the states are all kind of smooshed together there under the right-hand legend. But overall, you can see, as we saw previously, there was a peak in April. The data are pretty noisy. We've had some reporting issues. There actually are some huge negative numbers of doses administered that I removed from the bottom of this graph. But overall, the trend is we went up a lot in the beginning. It peaked in April and went down in July. Then it started getting bad again, and people thought, well, maybe I should go get that vaccine. And it rose again, and kind of now, as the cases are subsiding, it's heading down a little bit. So, but they're still around 0.2 per 100 per day, which is fairly low. The rates span a range of about 4 to 1 across the states. So a pretty, fairly large range in terms of vaccination rates across the states. These are for the last week, who's had the highest per capita vaccinations. This top one is Alaska. So Alaska is, experiencing a lot of issues from their large outbreak, and you saw that on the peaking graph and the number of new cases per capita. So they've been averaging about 0.44 per 100 per day, which is more than twice the average in the US. The low is West Virginia, only about 0.12 per 100 per day in terms of vaccinations. And most of the states are in this 0.2 to 0.3 range. But that is behavior we've seen consistently. When things were really bad in Missouri, the daily doses of vaccination administered went up. In the Southeast, it went up in a lot of the Southeast states when they were in a lot of difficulty with their hospitalizations and so forth. But as that subsides, it looks like the demand for vaccinations subsides also. This is a repeat of the analysis with updated data I did on vaccination rates among states and new cases and new deaths. And the significance in terms of the p-value, which is how unlikely is this relationship to be observed if there's really not a relationship between the two variables you're looking at. The p-values actually keep going down, which means the statistical relationship is strengthening. These are percent of the population fully vaccinated 30 days ago versus new cases per 1,000 over the last 30 days. So how many people were were vaccinated on September 1st, and then how many new cases per thousand were there between September 1st and October 1st. Same thing with fatalities. How many people were vaccinated September 1st? How many fatalities per million were experienced in that 30 days following September 1st? And the correlation is clear. The estimate is it explains a little bit less than half of the variability among states in terms of the fatalities per thousand is accounted for by variation in vaccination, degree of vaccination of the populations. So both cases and states, even though, I think from what we hear about breakthrough infections, and it's easy to get the impression that the vaccine with the Delta variant isn't very effective at preventing you from becoming a case, which is not true, certainly based on these data, and I think also on the other academic things that have been published, that it is certainly the Delta is more likely to cause a breakthrough infection, but you're still significantly less likely to get an infection if you've been vaccinated, even if you're exposed to the Delta variant. And certainly with fatalities, it's a very big improvement. This is the way it looks in Santa Barbara. New case rates per 100,000 for unvaccinated in red. This is the same graph I showed last month, just extended in time. The blue is vaccinated and the gray is overall. So it's about 3 to 4 times the case rate among the unvaccinated population. So just reinforcing the point I just made about, even though all these are breakthrough infections down here, it's only about a quarter of the number that are happening in the unvaccinated population. And this is the way we've been going in Santa Barbara County for vaccinations. Not really much different than the US. So went up a lot, really peaked in April. Many people wanted the vaccine, started going down, bottomed out about in July. Cases started going up again, and there was a little bit of increase. And then we're seeing it go back down a little bit in September. So the minimum, after getting up to I don't remember the exact number, 4,000 maybe a day. We are down to about 600 in July at a minimum. We went up to about 900 in August, and then September we're back down to about 750. For Santa Barbara, 65% of the population has received at least one dose, which is about 3% higher than last month. 58% of the population is fully vaccinated, which is also about 3% higher. If you look at just who's eligible to be vaccinated, it's about 77% that have received at least one dose and about 68% that are fully vaccinated. So still below kind of the public health targets for the degree of vaccination. And then the graph on the bottom there is by age demographics. And so it's highest and similar once you look at demographics 50 years and older. They're all pretty similar. And then it's lower in the below 50 age group. So those are all the updates. So the summary that I always go through, for the current outbreaks, the global total now is predicted to be about 250 million cases and about 5 million deaths, which is a 2% case fatality risk, which is really right where the global case fatality risk is right now. The case forecast is the same. The death forecast is a little bit lower than a month ago. So a month ago was 6 million fatalities were predicted. And again, it assumes that things proceed in each of the individual country outbreaks along the path they're currently on, and there aren't any more new resurgences. And as we vaccinate more and eventually I won't have to say resurgences are going to keep occurring, but for right now, it's likely that they will. There's a lot of unvaccinated people in a lot of places. The case fatality risk is still pretty much the same as it's been for the last 5 months. It hasn't moved much. So it started high, went down kind of a lot, went up a little bit, and now it's been about the same. for about 5 months. So that's it for today, this week's update. So if anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to take them.
How was the wedding?
The wedding was great. It was, the Monday after we found out we'd spent the weekend in a house with 2 people that had COVID was a little troubling, but it doesn't seem like we got it. So that was good.
Thank you, Dave. That was
Well,
great.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Dave.